He called her worthless, the night the sky cracked open with thunder, never knowing the woman he belittled had just bought the company that signed his father's paychecks. In the restaurant's amber light, Ethan Adebayo held court about standards and bloodlines, sawing the air with a fork as if authority sharpened on silver, while Naomi Okoye folded her napkin and listened the way an ocean listens to storms, quiet at the surface, measuring the undertow. He bragged that North Star steel would soon cut the weak wood, that real men survived the axe, that office girls should learn their place and thank the men who gave them chairs. Naomi's eyes drifted to the rain stippling the window, to the reflection of a woman who had spent a decade learning every inch of the plant, the safety rails and broken elevators, the old furnaces that coughed like grandparents, the payroll lines where names lived next to numbers. She remembered Femi Adebayo's handshake, firm, warm, calloused with honest years, and the way he'd said, "My child, have you eaten?" the first time she toured the floor in a hard hat and borrowed boots. Ethan kept talking as if noise could become architecture. He itemized her supposed defects: a simple black dress, unbranded flats, a watch that kept time instead of catching light. He called patience, weakness, and kindness a liability, then laughed, delighted by the echo of himself. When his phone buzzed with a rumor about layoffs, he held it up like a trophy. "See, the pruning has begun." Naomi thought of the press release waiting in a drafts folder, time-stamped for morning, the sentence that would move quietly through the city. North Star Steel has been acquired by O&O Holdings. She tasted pepper soup, thanked the waiter by name, and studied the boy's reddening ears after Ethan snapped at him and called the spice cheap. Thunder rolled. The lights hiccuped and steadied. Somewhere across town, a printer warmed to spit out new ID badges. Somewhere else, a meeting invite arranged itself on Femi's calendar for 9 a.m., flagged high priority. Subject line, Mentorship Program Expansion. Naomi felt the cooling certainty that arrives when a door has already been unlocked and only waits to be opened. Ethan leaned back, stretching his voice to reach the interns at the next table. He praised his father's grit, then used that grit to sand strangers. He called charity a performance, humility a costume, compassion a tax on the ambitious. He asked Naomi if she wanted dessert or just an apology for not being enough. She smiled the way gates do when only one person has the key. "I have an early start," she said, laying her napkin with surgical care. He rolled his eyes and muttered fragile. Outside, rain combed the street into silver threads. A black sedan idled at the curb, unnoticed by the man admiring his reflection in the window he mistook for a mirror. In the glove compartment rested the pen she had used to sign her name. On her phone, a draft glowed with a single opening line to the employees of North Star. "I'm honored to join you." She stepped into the rain, letting it cool her face, and the storm, as if recognizing a promise kept, softened its hands against the city. Behind her, Ethan called his father to boast about putting someone in their place, and Femi's steady voice urged gentleness that did not land. He called his victory sweet. He called Naomi small. He called the night his. Unaware he had just insulted the new owner. Unaware that Dawn would print her name above his father's livelihood. Unaware he had called his storm. Morning slid in on steam and the hum of generators as Femi Adebayo laced his boots by feel and stepped into a dawn that smelled of wet iron. At North Star Steel, turnstiles clicked, vests flashed, gossip traveled, and a whisper about a memo rode the air. Femi's laugh landed softly. He had seen storms pass and roofs hold. He led 2 apprentices toward Furnace 3 with patience that moved at the speed of trust, thumb brushing the gouge in his hard hat where a stray bolt had once kissed him awake. He did not know the pen that signed new ownership had warmed the night before in a glove compartment he would never open. Across the street, a private car idled. Naomi Okoye stepped out in steel-toed boots and a plain jacket, a generic inspector's badge pinned where titles usually shout. She had come for the first sound of the shift, to hear what a company sings when it forgets it is being watched. Heat and clangor braided around her as she asked about handrails, burn cream, and days off, answers arrived as shrug smiles and jokes thinned by use. She marked a locker with a broken latch, an emergency shower that stuttered, a forklift path with a blind turn veiled in shadow at noon. She paused when Femi explained metallurgy with plantains, how ripeness is chemistry. You can smell his voice, warm gravel, his calm, a discipline. The calculus settled, the cost of a guardrail against the price of an avoidable scar. Bonuses, measured in dignity. At 9, screens blinked blue. A subject line unfurled. Transition announcement. Femi read for a younger coworker with fogged glasses. North Star Steel welcomes O&O Holdings, effective immediately. Commitment to safety, reinvestment in machinery, mentorship, expansion. No layoffs without retraining. Review of supervisor conduct. Someone whistled. Someone swore. Someone joked the coffee might finally taste like coffee. Femi nodded to the shape of it, then returned to the heat with steady shoulders. Elsewhere, Ethan scrolled over cereal, performing indifference. He texted Naomi, "Are you seeing the chaos?" adding a laughing emoji he believed converted arrogance into charm. Her phone buzzed while she logged a foreman's answer about overtime. She let the message dissolve into silence. At noon, from the mezzanine, she studied yellow lines, crane choreography, and slag glittering like fallen stars. Years ached in her bones. Steadiness followed decision the way dawn follows night. She ate in the cafeteria where a microwave rattled and a poster promised safety was everyone's job. 2 tables away, Femi sliced an orange and passed wedges to whoever wandered near, keeping none until the last hand was offered. She watched generosity that cannot be ordered by policy, then left a card with a bland title on the foreman's tray. In the afternoon, rain tapped the roof like fingers counting down. By shift's end, small changes began their quiet work. A sign repositioned, a railing tightened, a rumor revised. At the side gate, the guard called her Madam Inspector and told her to mind the puddle shaped like Africa. She stepped wide and tasted the metallic afterglow of progress. She thought of names soon to appear on scholarship lists, of gloves that would fit small hands, of mentoring calendars expanding into daylight. She thought, too, of a dinner table where Ethan would treat news as sport and call ownership a game. She tucked the badge into her pocket, felt its cool rectangle, and turned back once to watch Femi lift his face to the rain. The plant exhaled. The city inhaled relief. The rest waited for morning, with quiet certainty. By the time the city shook the rain from its shoulders and put on its late morning glare, Ethan had converted last night's swagger into a presentation no one requested. Pacing his father's small sitting room with a laser pointer he used on the beige wall, like it was a battlefield map and not peeling paint. He explained to Femi how the acquisition would bring new blood and necessary ruthlessness, promising that men who couldn't keep up with the times would be shuffled aside with dignity, an elegant phrase that meant a cardboard box and a folded smile. Yet Femi only tied his bootlaces and said that Steele remembered who heated it with care. At the plant, Naomi walked the administrative corridor, where framed photos showed decades of faces squinting into the future, pausing to memorize the names beneath. Welders with nicknames that fit like calluses, office managers who made broken systems bend toward mercy, a janitor who had once stopped a conveyor with his body so a child's scarf wouldn't be swallowed whole. The HR office smelled of toner and worry, and the interim director, cheeks wind-chapped by stress, blinked at the new badge and the card with Naomi's unassuming title before ushering her into a conference room, still echoing with the old guard's laughter. There, Naomi laid out a sheet that looked humble as grocery lists, but held the bright edges of revolution. Mentorship stipends, safety audits with teeth, an anonymous line run by people who actually pick up, retraining funds indexed to years served, and a clause that stared like a lighthouse at the fog. Promotions require human decency, measurable and maintained. In the break room, word metastasized into hope. With the speed of hunger finding bread, While upstairs, a foreman practiced a new tone in his mouth, like a borrowed hat. At lunch, Ethan arrived with cologne, too sharp for the cafeteria, shook hands he didn't see, and clapped the shoulder of a man who had once loaned him pocket money when he was 12 because Femi's paycheck came late. He inspected Naomi's plain jacket and invited her to sit with the adults, then insisted on explaining steel tariffs to the woman who had negotiated the purchase that neutralized them. And when she asked him whether he had ever read a maintenance report all the way down to the footnotes, he laughed at the concept of footnotes and called them nerd margins, drawing a chorus of uneasy chuckles that melted when Femi entered with his lunch pail and nodded to Naomi with the simple dignity that crowns the unvarnished. Naomi's eyes softened at the sight of father and son standing in the same light while facing different directions, then, sharpened as an engineer, rushed in with photos of a hairline crack near the mezzanine rail and a list of small scares that had been logged and lost in the last regime. Nothing fatal yet. The kind of almost disasters that become eulogies if ignored. Naomi moved like a metronome set to care, ordering temporary closures, redirecting crews, stepping onto the floor to run her hand along the compromised seam as if steel could be comforted by touch. And when Ethan scoffed at overreaction, Femi's voice, quiet as a prayer, said that a life you can save is a life you must save. For a flicker, Ethan looked 10 and bewildered, then sneered his confusion into arrogance and promised to speak to management about interruptions to production, the sentence dangling unaware between the woman who signed management's pay and the man who believed volume could substitute for value. Sunset rimmed the stacks in copper. The crack got a brace. A mechanic went home to read to his daughter under the certainty of tomorrow, and Naomi, at her desk after hours, signed the first set of adjustments with a pen that still smelled faintly of rain. The city woke with stingy light and a cold resolve, and Naomi matched it with a schedule that turned like a well-oiled gear. Audits at 7, safety walk at 8, town hall at noon. Each item a stitch closing the seam between promise and proof. She began on the floor, where heat braided with breath, and the new braces on the mezzanine gleamed like fresh scars that would someday be stories. She listened as a crane operator described the rhythm of fatigue and marked a ladder whose wobble felt like a rumor of regret. In a corner office once reserved for men with framed golf photos, she spread charts that translated numbers into obligations. By mid-morning, posters came down and were replaced by procedures written in words plain enough to survive heat. The anonymous line went live with an operator whose first language was patience, and a maintenance budget swelled for bolts, guards, gloves, and time. Femi moved through the plant with his steady gravity, adjusting his pace to match the youngest legs, folding his worry into teaching. He demonstrated a grip, an angle, a pause before pressure. And in each motion, Naomi saw the dividend of a life spent choosing care. Ethan, meanwhile, toured the floor like a tourist chasing souvenirs, pointing at sparks as if they applauded him, stopping a mechanic mid-task to ask for a photo that would play well online. When a supervisor introduced Naomi as a consultant, he smirked, congratulated himself on spotting wasted overhead, and promised he would help the new owners get efficient. Naomi thanked the supervisor, walked away, and set a timer in her head for the noon gathering, where sunlight would cut the dust into visible columns and truth would be portioned carefully into sentences that could hold the weight of consequence. At 12, the siren that usually announced lunch opened the room. Workers clustered in constellations, hard hats under arms. Faces alert in that particular silence, factories know when something more than routine has arrived. Naomi stood at the edge of the platform. No fanfare, no podium. Her jacket the color of asphalt after rain. She began with gratitude for the hands that made heat into livelihood, named apprentices, cited last night's brace as the difference between a scare and a scar, and pledged the obvious like it was sacred, that nobody would trade a wrist for a quota. She announced scholarships, retraining credits, and a schedule of paid hours for cross-skill learning. She mentioned audits with teeth, an ombuds program immune to favoritism, and a code of conduct where yelling would be treated as failure to manage rather than style. A hush swelled into a sound like relief. Femi nodded once, as if a prayer had found its landing. Ethan clapped loudly, then launched a speech about market share, speed, and how lean operations require cutting sentiment. He framed thrift as courage and called safety a cost center, needing realistic caps. Naomi let him finish, then said the caps were off. The spending would match the value of a life, and efficiency would be measured by mornings everyone lived to see. In the back, someone laughed softly. In the front, a foreman swallowed a habit and tried on respect. When it ended, Naomi stepped down and walked the aisles, shaking hands, taking questions, making appointments. Ethan snapped a selfie with the banner behind him and typed a caption about taking charge. Outside, clouds stacked like filings drawn to a magnet. Inside, a new alignment, settled, quiet, and exact, the kind that makes a machine run true without asking for applause. After the town hall, the plant exhaled a steadier breath, and Naomi spent the afternoon stitching intent into fabric, moving from welding bays to payroll cubicles with a clipboard and a mind that kept inventories of dignity. She scheduled hearing tests, funded a locker replacement program, and authorized a rotating half-day for parents to attend school meetings without surrendering pay. Small gears that would turn larger ones until care became habit. She stood beside the old press that coughed when pushed too hard, listening to the mechanic who spoke to machines like elders, and when he admitted he dreamt of a guard that didn't rattle like teeth, she wrote down the make and cost, and circled both. Femi found her near the tool cage, where a sign still read, "Work harder than your problems." He straightened it and said, "Problems should work harder than people." She asked about apprentices who measured heat with their eyes, and he told her about Layla's quick hands and Musa's patience. She asked nothing about Ethan, though his voice drifted all day like a radio left on, volume up, clarity down. In a binder-crowded office, Naomi met the union rep. They spoke of grievance boxes that swallowed letters and pay scales that turned fairness into algebra. And she promised a rewrite in language that fit on one page and held in practice. Ethan denied the spotlight he believed came standard, invented one. He posted himself on the mezzanine and lectured air about optimization. When an apprentice asked where scrap bins should go to cut double handling, he waved her off and said engineers would handle thinking. Naomi took a tape measure, did the math with the apprentice, and solved it in 5 minutes the girl would remember as a hinge. Mid-afternoon brought procurement, a ledger that recorded the cost of neglect in ink and overtime. She flagged a glove supplier that failed like promises, and approved another whose fibers held when heat flirted with skin. She signed for fall arrest harnesses that didn't pinch, thought of names that would never become memorials, and breathed easier. An email from legal pinged. Finalized disclosures by Friday, press conference Monday. She read it twice, considering the choreography of revelation, the timing, the faces who should hear first, the man who would learn last because he had listened least. On break she sat with Femi by the loading dock. He talked about retirement he could see, but didn't feel ready to cross, and she decided to build him a railing wide enough for hesitance and hope. He asked what brought her to steel. She said the sound of honest work, the romance of heat tamed for shelter, the childhood memory of a roof repaired before a storm. And he nodded. Near shift end, Ethan cornered her by the clock with a grin lacquered onto impatience, and said the new owners would prize aggressive thinkers, unafraid to trim fat. He offered a list of people who, in his view, softened schedules and hardened costs. Naomi held his gaze the way a level holds a bubble, and answered, the only fat to cut was waste, disguised as swagger. He laughed and promised she'd think differently once she met the decision-makers. She walked away, not from fear but from focus, and made 2 notes. Speak to the son whose mouth outran his inheritance, and honor the father whose hands built payrolls could total. The siren rose, boots scuffed, hats tilted. Tomorrow lined up like billets on a cooling rack, and Naomi set her pen on the day and called it good enough to deserve another. On Monday, the city put on its best shirt and pretended not to notice the cameras, and at North Star Steel, the air tasted of coffee and change as workers gathered under a banner that read "Welcome" in letters wide enough to hold doubt. Naomi stood off to the side in the same plain jacket, notes in her pocket, while legal checked microphones and the comms team rehearsed names, and Ethan, hair sculpted into confidence, whispered to a supervisor that the mystery buyer needed a strong hand to keep costs down, then called his father a sentimental relic for worrying about people before numbers, and promised to put in a word once the real decision started, unaware he was speaking in a room already tuned to another frequency. At 9 sharp, the plant manager opened with stale gratitude, then seeded the floor. Naomi walked forward without choreography, set her notes aside, and spoke like a person who knew what heat could do to metal and cruelty to a spine, naming the safety upgrades already ordered, the scholarships already funded, the promotion code already adopted, and when she said, "My name is Naomi Okoye, and O&O Holdings is my company," the room shifted its weight as if the building itself had exhaled. Surprise. Femi's eyes widened, then softened into something like relief, stitched with pride, and a ripple of whispers curved toward Ethan, where he stood blinking, expression cracking like glaze under kiln. He groped for a joke and found only the echo of his own voice from nights past, the laughter at footnotes, the sermon against kindness, the boast over cereal, and he tried to step into the space where men usually go to shake the hand of power, but Naomi wasn't dispensing favors. She was reading names from a card, calling out apprentices for quick thinking, mechanics for midnight fixes, and Femi for decades of mentorship that built a backbone into the place. Cameras clicked. A reporter asked about layoffs. Naomi explained retraining timelines, the dignity clause, the ombuds program, each syllable a bolt in a beam. Ethan, cornered by the math of consequence, demanded to speak, grabbed a microphone, and delivered a quivering lecture on competitiveness that used words like streamline and prune until they sounded like apologies dressed as courage. And when he tried to wrap it in filial piety by invoking his father's grit, Femi stepped close to him, touched his arm, and said gently but clearly that grit without mercy is just grinding, that his boy's mouth had run faster than his feet, that steel listens only to the hand that respects it. Silence stood up. Naomi nodded once to the elder's lesson, then finished with a vow that the company would never chase profit into a graveyard, and the room answered with the low thunder of gloves clapping hard palms. Afterward, she crossed to Femi with a certificate for the first mentorship endowment bearing his name, and he accepted it the way a man accepts water after a long walk, whispering that the place felt different today, lighter around the ribs. Ethan hovered, small inside an expensive shirt, and when he finally found words, they sounded like a door trying not to slam. If she'd needed his expertise, she should have said so sooner. Naomi met him with the same steady gaze she'd used on weak railings, and said expertise begins with listening. Then she offered him the simplest line of mercy. Stay, learn, earn, respect the way your father did. Or step aside where harm can't hide behind confidence, and left the choice on his own tongue. The plant rolled back into motion, sparks rising like tiny hallelujahs. Apprentices measured twice and cut once. The anonymous line rang and someone answered. A poster that used to shout, "Work faster," came down, and a whiteboard went up with 2 columns, problems and proofs. Outside, the sky opened into a clean blue that felt newly possible. Femi called his wife to say the new boss knew the weight of a wrench. Ethan stood alone long enough to hear himself, then walked toward his father and asked how to start again. Naomi watched them from the mezzanine, hands on the rail she had braced, the future humming beneath like a machine aligned, and she smiled, not the smile of a victor counting spoils, but of a builder counting mornings everyone will live to see.